Good afternoon all. I joined the university back in March as Telecoms and Network Programme Manager, and I'd just like to take you along with me on some of the journey I've experienced so far. This is also a little bit about what I wish I'd known 6-8 months ago. So just a little bit of background on the university. We are just over 2,000 academic and professional services staff and just under 18,000 students this year. We've got 4 campuses across Kent, a large campus in Canterbury, a couple of medium-sized campuses with between 100 and 150 members of staff at those locations in Broadstairs and Medway, one small campus near Tunbridge Wells, and a number of other small remote sites. All of which were within scope for the project I'm going to talk about. The telephony today is a real mishmash and very much reflects a set of incremental investments over the years and sites being added and sites being taken away. So we've got a mixture of legacy telephony mainly on the Canterbury campus, plus a good deal of in-house run asterisk, which actually runs pretty well. Provides a good service, but is a complete pain around things like moves, adds, changes, configuration changes, because adding somebody to a hunt group involves a rather expensive resource editing a config file on a Linux box, as opposed to just pointing and clicking on a web user interface. All the external calls come in via ISDN 30 links, which are terminated at 3 sites currently, and unfortunately we do internal cross-charging for calls, which as you can imagine with such a mixed system is a complete pain, and as we move forward I think he's going to give me a few more grey hairs, frankly. So the mandate, when I arrived it had been a lump of capital had been set aside by the university to replace the telephony system and fully enable unified comms. So I walked through the door and said, well, what do you mean by unified comms? And I asked several different people and got several different answers, which was interesting in itself. So one of the first jobs was to really define what was meant by unified comms and where the key priorities were. The other constraint in this project is that we had significant amounts of capital to invest, but lots of people saying, but we need to minimise the ongoing OPEX, which certainly points to an on-premise solution, although I'm not pretending that's the only possible solution. So various discussions later, unified comms we decided included the key items really are presence, instant messaging, video as well as voice, and tools for collaboration. I think somebody said, was it Oxford said that the killer app really is the one number, the one means of contacting people, and that's certainly something that's generated a lot of interest and is one of the key deliverables from the programme we're about to embark on. Some of the key use cases for staff is around contact centre use and particularly clearing. So clearing is very clearly in scope for the project. One of the things that people weren't asking for immediately was around flexible working and particularly hot desking. But one of the key things is this will add the capability for hot desking, which would be almost impossible today as far as telephony is concerned, but it should make it a straightforward option in the future. There's also quite a lot of interest around the usual collaboration, application sharing, desktop sharing, virtual meetings, etc. There are some use cases around non-academic student interactions. So there's a lot of focus in the university about making the student journey a lot smoother, a lot slicker, and the interactions, whether it's an inquiry from a prospective student or somebody phoning up about their accommodation or whatever the interaction is, just making that a lot more slick, because it's not particularly slick today. So although there's a single point of contact, behind that single point of contact there are lots of diverse groups and different ways of contacting them, different ways of talking to them. So one of the concepts we've come up with is if the unified comms system knows who a student is and the student calls in or IMs in or starts a video call, very quickly you can bring up that student's details and you can find out why they might be calling in, some of the history, etc. Whereas today it's quite a painful process where there's a conversation, well, who are you, and are you this John Smith or that John Smith? And we're keen to short circuit all that. On the academic side of things, again, these are kind of nice to have and possibilities. It's been very difficult to get a clear consensus among the academic community in the university, but there's talk and there's interest in trying things out like virtual tutorials, where instead of physically meeting in one location, there's a kind of virtual meeting room and collaboration goes on there. Virtual lectures, the ability to record lectures, and also another potential use case is just better availability of academics to the students. So one of the common complaints we hear from the students is that the academics aren't very available. They're possibly available but very limited hours, and we see this as a potential tool to extend that. So some of the key use cases for students, there's been discussion and there's a lot of interest in rolling out UC capability to students. One of the things they tell us a lot is that in terms of preferences as to the way they communicate, is that they really like to communicate via social media and instant messaging, and they hate communicating by voice and to some extent in person. And yet, if you need to call accommodation about your accommodation, or you need to call student services, typically what you do is, as I said, the word call, you pick up the phone and you communicate that way. So we're keen to shift that paradigm to some extent, and we're also keen, as I mentioned earlier, that the UC system is aware of who the students are. So when a student IMs accommodation to say my sink's blocked, can somebody come and sort it out, we immediately know who that student is, and there's not the usual toing and froing, working out who they are and where they live, etc. But the real elephant in the room, as far as all this is concerned, is that as we've gone around the university gathering requirements, talking to different groups, we've had very mixed levels of enthusiasm for different features. The culture in the university is that senior management mandates are very unlikely. So if we're talking about something like presence, it's unlikely that anyone in the university is going to say, you will use presence and you will use it in a particular way. So the conclusion from that, and some of the discussion earlier was helpful with my thoughts here, but that we are likely to get patchy uptake. So any solution potentially needs some kind of flexible licensing, or just a very good deal for essentially the ability to turn everything on. So I undertook some steps to really talk to the leading suppliers about all this, and I want to share some of what I've discovered in that, because I think if you're embarking on a unified comms project, hopefully this will short-circuit at least some of the discussions, or as a minimum give you some pointers as to some of the things that we've kind of stumbled across and discovered, and you should think about as you go through this. So potentially use some of these ideas to guide you and to flag up some things, but don't take any of this as gospel. And as I think we found out earlier, if you ask Microsoft questions about licensing, and particularly licensing for students, you may get different answers, because I think there were 2 different answers this morning, and indeed I was sitting there thinking, I think I've had a 3rd different answer to some of those similar questions. So the first thing we've concluded really after talking to a number of the main suppliers is that pretty much most providers will meet 95% of our requirements, or probably closer to 100% in reality. That there are differences in the detail, and certainly some suppliers can do things better than others, and in a way we're more comfortable with. But for those major requirements, I think you can go to any of the major suppliers and pretty much they'll tick all the boxes. But it's when you start looking at the detail it gets more interesting, and also some of the licensing models. So I've got a couple of slides here on differentiators and really things to watch out for. So I mentioned at the beginning that we have a number of VoIP extensions already, around half the population. Those use SIP phones that we've already bought, and we were very careful to buy phones that were as SIP compliant as we could get. But in talking to different suppliers, there are very different attitudes really to use of existing handsets. So some have almost said, oh, no, you don't want to do that, and what's more, we probably won't support it. You'll have extremely limited functionality. Others have said, yes, actually, we're quite happy to support your existing handsets if you bear in mind the functionality will be limited in certain areas. This is important for us because with 1,000 handsets already, we don't really want to be throwing away that investment. And the conclusion we came to getting indicative quotes is that handsets are probably 20 to 35% of certainly an on-prem capital funded solution cost for unified comms, and could be over 50% for voice only. There are also some solutions that basically the default position is they do away with the desktop phone. And I'm thinking there particularly of Skype for Business, which tends to lend itself to an app on the desktop and not really the lump of plastic that actually, talking to most users, they tell us they want. They tell us they want to keep hold of. I think time will tell as far as that's concerned, but that's certainly quite a strong message we've got from most of the university, that they do want a phone on the desk. Some other differentiators. We've had some interesting discussions about possible use of APIs in a unified comms solution. So in this environment where the unified comms solution knows who the student is, and potentially they have an app on their smart device, we may be able to IM them from the library system to say your book is overdue, and have that happen automatically in some way. And also another idea we've had is that potentially the timetabling system knows who's due in a particular tutorial. So if we're running a virtual tutorial, they only need to click on a button and not enter some complicated code to work out where they should be joining. And in talking with some of the suppliers, they see this as a key future differentiation. So I think when we finally go out to market, we will be asking quite a lot of questions in the invitation to tender about APIs and the capability of APIs and the openness of APIs. So again, if you're embarking on this kind of project, it's well worth at least looking into this and looking at the possibilities. Now I come on to licensing, and this reminds me to some extent of the slide of spaghetti I saw earlier, because I thought, well, if we have some conversations about licensing, with any luck we'll get a picture of how things tend to be licensed, and that can help inform our procurement. And I think at the end of all the discussions we've probably just come away a little bit more confused and not really knowing what to do, although I'll come onto at the end what we are going to do. But there's certainly some complexity there. So some suppliers tend to license mainly on end users and end users capability. So if you just want a courtesy phone or something, that will cost you an amount. If you want basic UC functionality, that will cost you something else. And there are tiers of functionality and some specialized tiers of licensing involving, for example, contact center is one that comes up in particular. So those are relatively straightforward to understand. In other cases, the costs depend quite heavily on the back-end features you want to license. So, for example, things like remote site survivability. Again, in some of the conversations with suppliers, some of the suppliers were saying, yes, actually that's a separate license, and in some cases that's quite a significant chunk of the cost. So it's well worth asking some of these questions. Yes, I mentioned the tiers of functionality. But very often you talk to different suppliers and they have different tiers. We were hoping for a fairly consistent model, so possibly in the invitation to tender we could say, well, we want this many of this sort of user and this many of this sort of user. Actually, it's probably not going to work like that. We're going to have to be much more explicit, because different vendors have a different model for what they count as a particular tier of licensing. The other thing we noticed is that economies of scale vary a lot, particularly if you license things in the cloud or you run things in the cloud. It tends to be that 1,000 licenses will cost you 1,000 times as much as one license. So you may get discounts there to some extent, but really it's pretty linear in scalability. But then there are other conversations we had where there were very, very significant discounts around breakpoints, and 1,000 licenses would cost an awful lot less than 1,000 times the cost of one license. So again, you need to look at this fairly carefully and have conversations with your suppliers, get indicative quotes, and understand this stuff probably before you go out to procurement. The other thing we found is that some suppliers were extremely open and happy to talk about this and provide us indicative quotes, whereas other suppliers, we'd say, oh, you know, can we arrange a chat about your licensing model? And frankly, we come out of it none the wiser, and often with just an impression that the thing to go for is the enterprise license, because that makes all these problems go away. But we suspect the suppliers have very good reasons for pushing you down that route. One of the channel partners we talked to had a potentially interesting model that kind of sparked our interest. And one of the challenges is we've already said we'd like all the students to be aware of the licensing, the UC system to be aware of who students are. Now, potentially this means 18,000 student accounts, and even at a few pounds per year per student, that adds up to quite a significant sum over 5 years. But one of the channel partners we talked to had a potentially interesting model. They said, well, the costs are based on the maximum concurrent logged-in users. So if there's a model where a student's smart device isn't logged in by default, but is only logged in when they need to do something, this potentially gives an interesting way of allowing a loss of flexibility in terms of student numbers registered on the system without incurring commensurately very large costs. I think the other thing I can say is that in discussion with some of the suppliers, they were very interested in the ideas about students being a part of the system, but recognised our cost constraints and recognised that there may be ways they can be flexible and allow this to happen. I've already mentioned, really, cloud options generally give a much simpler scalability to a lot of this. Unfortunately, we're in the position where we've got a nice lump of capital to invest, but haven't really got the recurrent, so that does tend to lend itself to an on-prem model. And if you don't know what you'll need, which is the position we find ourselves in for some of these features, then a cloud option gives you that real flexibility to scale up and scale down without necessarily missing out on breakpoints or hitting expensive thresholds. I'll say a few words about Skype for Business because we had some interesting conversations with Microsoft and Civica, their partner who we tend to work with, about Skype for Business and about licensing of Skype for Business. So again, if you're going into this, these are some things you'll be, well, if you're already in this, there'll be some things here you're very familiar with, but if you're getting into this, there are certainly some things to watch out for. So this is an example of one of the Skype for Business reference architecture diagrams that you can download from the Microsoft website. And I think it's one of 5, it might be one of 4 or so. And they all tend to look like this, and they're very colourful and quite complicated looking. In the initial discussions with Skype with Microsoft and Civica, the message was, well, Skype for Business is essentially packaged as part of your campus agreement because we take Office 365. So we thought, oh, great, that's a result. And then you probed them a bit more, and they said, and actually you need to license Skype for Business Server. We said, well, OK, how much is that? Can you give us an indicative quote? Got the quote back and thought, oh, that's not bad. We can roll out a Skype for Business solution quite cheaply. Had more discussions with them, and suddenly you find there are all these components underneath that relate very much to this underlying diagram that are licensed separately. And some of them can be quite expensive, and it does mount up. So again, if you're looking into this and looking into Skype for Business as a potential UC solution, make sure you have some of those detailed discussions. Having said all that, the costs probably, based on indicative quotes and the work we've done so far, probably still look pretty attractive, which I think is why quite a large number of universities have rolled out Skype for Business, and it's a popular solution. But certainly bear this in mind. And certainly bear in mind, as I think we heard this morning from Ulster, that Skype for Business can't do everything. So you will end up working with a number of different partners and potentially buying and licensing a number of different components to make the whole solution work. So be a little bit careful there and do have those detailed discussions with Microsoft or with their channel partner. There's another possible gotcha depending on the solution you go for, And one thing we were potentially looking at is, well, can we look to one supplier to do the telephony side of things and then integrate that with Skype for Business to do all the other unified comms functionality. And the possible gotcha is it can be very hard to integrate presence with certain vendors. So some suppliers will say, yep, fine, we'll talk to Skype for Business and all the presence will work across the two platforms. Others will say, no, it doesn't work at all. So again, just watch out for that depending on what route you go down. I should say this isn't the route we will probably be taking, but just in case, there's a flag there. Clearing, I guess the biggest caution here is that most of the suppliers are very used to the fact that we do clearing and we need this burst of contact center type licenses for a month or so in August once a year. But just be careful that you're not caught out in that you license a certain number and then find out that if you go beyond that, actually it suddenly gets very expensive. So I think the conclusion is that licensing is complex, and what we originally thought when we went into this exercise is that, well, potentially we can use that to decide to some extent how we structure our invitation to tender. But actually we've come to the conclusion it's probably too hard to do that, and the different offerings from the different vendors probably shouldn't influence that too much. So the solution we're going for, where we're struggling to understand uptake, we might get 100% uptake for some features. We might actually end up finding that they never get beyond that 16% that we were hearing about earlier. But for your procurement, a suggestion here is pick a few scenarios that you think are likely. So maybe pick there's pretty much uptake for everything, but also solutions where there's the basic voice service and a few other bits and pieces. And then, as part of the procurement, ask the costs for each of those scenarios and then weight them based on how likely you think they are in your environment and score based on the weighted total. And particularly possibly take some extremes so that just in case you do end up in an extreme environment, you're taking that into account as well. And we're hoping that by doing that, taking that approach, that will give us good value overall, almost whatever the outcome and whatever level of uptake we get or otherwise for the various features as part of the Unified Comms Suite. So that concludes the talk, and I think we've got a couple of minutes for questions, Mark.
Yep. Anyone got questions for John?
Always at the front. I haven't really got a question, I just want to see if you can John, hi, it's Terry from Netcall. When you've been talking to these suppliers about the licensing models, has any of the conversations gone down the roads of you just telling them what you'd like, rather than assuming that whatever model they're putting in front of you is written in stone?
I think some suppliers' models are a lot more written in stone, and some appear to be a lot more flexible to the point they won't tell you anything. It seems to be the picture. I mean, we have shared the position that I shared earlier that we've got a set of requirements, but we're actually quite vague on uptake, and it may be that some of the UC features, so for example, some of the collaboration features may only get a relatively small uptake, or actually we might find over time it grows to be quite significant, and we need that flexibility in the licensing. And yes, the answer is some of the suppliers have said, yes, there's a lot of flexibility there. But we're very keen that we don't get caught out, that we don't end up signing up to a particular solution and then suddenly find that collaboration tools or something do take off, and we're being landed with very large bills for license upgrades and those kinds of things. So that's where we're challenged, shall we say.
Okay.
Anybody else?
Nope.
Gary Parker, Loughborough University. Just wanted to add to your
concerns about ongoing licensing costs for your devices. One of the sticky situations that we found ourselves in at Loughborough with our Cisco Call Manager solution wasn't just the licensing for endpoints, but it was the ongoing maintenance.
Yes.
And the software subscriptions that we had to pay for it, and UCSS. We were questioning our suppliers when we were getting quotes in for stuff, saying, look, I asked you for a quote for device X, you've given me a quote for device X plus these 5 other line items, and it's doubling the cost of it. And it's eventually got to the situation where we're saying, well, can you give us a quote for the device without the maintenance? And then, strangely enough, they came back for the quote for the device, and it was more expensive for the device without the maintenance. We got into a discussion with them about this, and they said, oh yeah, Cisco makes us charge more for the devices if we don't sell a maintenance contract with it. So you get into swings and roundabouts as to where your costs are going to go there. If you want to take the risk of running your devices without maintenance, it's going to cost you more to buy them, unless you start strong-arming your account manager.
Yeah, thank you. And really, I should have said there, wherever I've said licensing, I mean licensing and maintenance. And depending on which supplier you go with, some of it's all very much built around licensing, and the maintenance is thrown in. Others, it's very separate. So yes, for licensing, read licensing and maintenance.